Hello, my Micto brothers, back again for another episode. And this one we're going to call Instrument to Institution. Now, this is going to be a foundational video that I'm going to use and refer back to in later episodes. So for all you that aren't interested in theory, you can either skip this one or maybe even bypass this one if you want, because there's going to be very little about Micto or women in this particular video. This is strictly to lay my arguments and my foundation for other videos. The reason that I'm doing this is to try to cut down on some of the time and length of my episodes. Instead of them going 20 to 25 to 30 minutes, I'm going to try to cut them down to about 15. And by separating out foundational material from the other videos, I think I can do this. So I'm going to attempt to use this as a model or a platform. So with that, we'll get into our material. In this section, we're going to be talking about social instruments. A social instrument is a social organization that is fulfilling effectively the purpose for which it arose. Every instrument consists of people organized in relationships to one another to satisfy a specific human need. Referring back to the diagram from Carol Quigley's Evolution of Civilizations, we see that the natural or physical environment surrounds culture, and that culture surrounds the human beings. Culture acts as a buffer zone between the human beings or human personalities and its natural environment. Culture is the realm where these social instruments or social organizations lie. Using another one of Quigley's diagrams, he describes a range of human potentialities or human needs. And if you look to the far right, you see the sixfold division of human needs. And that sixfold division is what we're going to be using in this particular episode. Sixfold division of human needs. To review, starting with the higher form, intellectual. Coming down, religious. More concrete, social, and economic. Then we go to political and military. The intellectual is the need for human understanding. The religious is the need for human psychological certainty. The social that describes interpersonal relationships between human beings, the need for companionship. The economic is the need for physical or material wealth. The political is the need to organize power. You have to, when you get a bunch of people, you have to organize people into effective groups. And the military is the need for group security. Describing the instruments for each of these particular levels, if the intellectual, you have to have, you have to have a certain instrument or organization to fulfill it, like science or philosophy, or is an instrument for the intellectual, the need for understanding. Christianity or Buddhism would be a social instrument for religion. Marriage and family, believe it or not, are instruments to satisfy interpersonal companionship. Agriculture or manufacturing is an example of an instrument to satisfy the need for material wealth. Democracy or communism is an example of the political, the need to organize power. Army or police, we don't think of police as being military, but Again, it is the need for group security. In this section, we're going to be talking about institutions. And for our purposes of this discussion, an institution will be defined as thus. An institution is an instrument that has taken on activities and purposes of its own, separate from and different from the purposes for which it was intended. As a consequence, an institution achieves its original purposes with decreasing effectiveness. Every instrument consists of people organized in relationships to one another. As the instrument becomes an institution, these relationships become ends in themselves, to the detriment of the ends of the whole organization. Simply as everything in nature, once created, eventually the creation takes on a life of its own. It wants to live, it wants to continue for its own purposes. Moreover, another reason why every instrument becomes an institution, everyone in such an organization is only human and has human weaknesses and ambitions, or at least has their human proclivity to see things from an egocentric point of view. Thus, in every organization, persons begin to seek their own advancements or to act for their own advantages, seeking promotions, decorations, increases in pay, better or easier assignments. These begin to absorb more and more of the same time and energies of the members of an organization. Finally, why every instrument becomes an institution. The social conditions surrounding any organization change in the course of time. When this happens, the organization must be changed to adapt itself to the changed condition, or it will function with decreased effectiveness. But the members of any organization generally resist such change. They have become vested interests. This process, which we call the institutionalization of instruments, is found in almost all social phenomena. For the institutionalization of social instruments is the most widespread of historical phenomena, and no observant person can fail to notice it. When instruments become institutions, as they all do, the organization achieves its function or purpose in society with decreasing effectiveness, and discontent with this performance begins to rise, especially among outsiders. These discontented suggest changes, which they call reforms. When these suggestions are not accepted or rejected by the established groups who control the criticized organization, conflicts and controversies begin. The discontented seeking to change the organization, while the vested interests seek to maintain their accustomed method of operation. While all good or all wrong is never entirely on one side in such controversies, discontent and controversy are unlikely to rise to any important level unless the organization is well institutionalized and considerably less effective than the society as a whole expects. Accordingly, when this degree of discontent is reached, the vested interest groups are generally tending to defend a relatively ineffective system, and the reformers are among many mistakes, generally advocating measures that would increase the organization's relative effectiveness in achieving its social purpose. The strain between the two groups engaged in a struggle such as this will be called the tension of development. From this tension and its ensuing controversy, there may emerge any one or combination among three possible outcomes: reform, circumvention, or reaction. In the first case, reform, the institution is reorganized and its methods of action change so that it becomes, relatively speaking, more of an instrument and achieves its purpose with sufficient facility to reduce tension to a social acceptable level. In the second case, circumvention, the institution is left with most of its privileges and vested interest intact, but its duties are taken away and assigned to a new instrument within the same society. And the third possible outcome, reaction. The vested interests triumph in the struggle, and the people of that society are doomed to an ineffective achievement of their needs on that level for an indefinite period. When an institution has been reformed or circumvented, there is once again an instrument on the level in question, and the purpose of that level is achieved with relative effectiveness. But once again, as always happens, the new instrument becomes an institution. Effectiveness decreases, the tension of development rises, and conflict appears. If the outcome of this conflict is either reform or circumvention, effectiveness increases and tension decreases. If the outcome is reaction, ineffectiveness becomes chronic and the tension remains high. Parliamentary government is a good example of reforming an institution. When a parliamentary government no longer serves the will or the direction that the populace wants it to go, that government is disbanded and elections are called for so that the parties can be reorganized or replaced so that the government closely or much closer reflects the will of the people. Reforms are instituted, policies are changed, cabinets are changed. So that is an example of how an institution is reformed rather than replaced. Now, circumvention is the second option. A good example of circumvention is how the English replaced the monarchy with a constitution. What they did is mostly strip most of the governing powers from the king or the monarch and replaced them or gave them to another instrument, which is the parliament and the prime minister. The king is reduced to mostly ceremonial activities. So even though he still has the king or queen still has the title and the king and queen still sits on the throne, all the needs or all the activities to fulfill the people's needs have been relegated or given to another entity. Now, an example of the third option, which is reaction, quickly gives an example of what happens when the people in the vested institution react and reject reforms. He gives an example of the agrarian system of ancient Rome. Now, the agrarian system of ancient Rome was an inefficient method of producing food, even in the respect of the existing technical knowledge. But to reform it would have involved the abolition of slavery and the division of large estates. The reformers who wanted to do this were assassinated by the daggers of the landlords, some even on the floor of the Senate itself. As a result, the economic needs of Rome could not be met, and the only way that Rome could survive was by use of the military and basically taking more and more land from conquered provinces. And in the end, the whole system fell because the military could no longer expand. A game called football was invented about 1870 to provide healthful physical exercise for the undergraduates on bright autumn afternoons. 70 years later, the undergraduates who needed exercise most were seated in the stands of a city baseball park on Friday night with their flask and their co-eds, while on the grass or mud below, the undergraduates who needed exercise least pushed each other about under the floodlights. The process by which football was almost imperceptibly transformed from an instrument for providing physical exercise to an institution acting as an obstacle to exercise for many students who loved the game and needed the exercise is as instructive an example of social development as changes in military tactics. The informal games of the 1860s and the early 1870s between groups from the same campus led little by little to challenges for the games with other institutions. This led to travel expenses, more formalized rules, nonpartisan officials, and uniforms. The increase in interest led to larger groups of spectators. What could be more natural than to pass a hat among these spectators to raise money for the players' expenses? Defeats led to desire for revenge and thus to stricter rules of team membership, practice, and training. All of this led gradually to more formalized coaching. This task rested at first with the captain and more experienced players, but as established intercollegiate rivalries began to grow, an experienced player of previous years, usually the last victorious captain, was asked to return from the outside world to coach intensively during the week before the big game. As other colleges adopted this pattern and several big games a year emerged, the demands on graduates to return to the campus for coaching duty became more than could be fulfilled. The obvious solution, a full-time paid coach, made it essential to have an established team income. Passing the hat among the spectators was replaced by sales of tickets at a fixed price. But sold tickets entitled spectators to a seat, which led very quickly to the building of the first modern stadium in 1903. In time, stadiums were being built with borrowed funds, with the result that their mortgage charges, along with coaches' salaries and other expenses, made it essential that the stadium seats, no matter how numerous, must be filled or nearly filled on the 8 or so Saturdays a year it was used. Gradually, the interest of the spectators and the need for football income became dominant over the interest of any undergraduate who liked football or needed exercise. The team had to win, at least most of the time, and the game had to be spectacular to watch. Scouts looked for able players outside, and in one way or another persuaded them to come to the Scouts College to play football. Financial rewards proved, in many cases, to be powerful persuaders. Thus, the game shifted from undergraduates who needed exercise to those who had already too much exercise. At some institutions where football incomes were earmarked for educational uses, such as for building funds, almost all games were played in baseball parks of large cities remote from the campus, with the result that team could rarely be seen by its own students. Teams that played on the East Coast, the West Coast, and the Gulf Coast on successive weekends spent much of the autumn traveling and might be away from their college halls for weeks. When the Depression cut attendance in the early 1930s, many games were scheduled in the evening to attract working spectators. For the same purpose, the rules were manipulated to give more open play, high scores, and superiority to the offense. By reducing the diameter of the football, it was made easier to pass and harder to kick, in the belief that spectators preferred passing. Restrictions on passing requiring a minimum distance behind the scrimmage line for the passer or penalizing successive incompleted passes were removed. To keep the ball moving on offense, the referee was instructed to move the ball in 15 yards from the sidelines when it became dead, closer than that distance from the sides. At no point in this process did many persons stop to ask themselves, what is the purpose of football anyway? But those who look at football's 90 years of development can see quite clearly how an organization which originally rose as an instrument for undergraduate exercise had become something quite different, to the jeopardy of the undergraduate exercise.